Welcome back, everyone, from our short break. My name is Cindy Goss, and I am a data scientist at LMI. I'm also a proud UVA alum. I received my bachelor's degree in mathematics, and I'm very excited to be speaking with you from On Grounds today. LMI is proud to sponsor this session on data and human rights, as we have a strong culture and growing practice in a very related arena of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. Our federal government clients recognize the need to evaluate and improve their DEIA maturity in order to comply with federal policies and realize the benefits of a diverse and inclusive workforce. By leveraging synthetic data that represents bias in recruiting and hiring across the seniority spectrum, LMI is creating data-driven models to assess, predict, and drive more positive DEIA outcomes for ourselves and for our customers. So with that short intro, I will kick it over to our session moderator, Karolina, and our wonderful panelists. I look forward to their discussion, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cindy, for kind introduction. So welcome all to Women and Data Science Charlottesville panel on data and human rights. From surveillance and privacy to automated decision systems, the connection between data, science, and civil and human rights is more important than ever. This panel will discuss and explore efforts to ameliorate the harms of datafication, as well as to use data in support of justice and rights. I am beyond delighted to be among three personal heroes on this topic. Three women who, through realizing work, is pushing the boundaries and bridging the gaps between classic human rights activism and data science work. Our three fantastic panelists are Megan Bryce, Executive Director, Human Rights Data Analysis Group; Maria De-Arteaga, Assistant Professor at the University of Texas at Austin; Deborah Hellman, a Professor of Law, UVA Law School. So for the workflow for this panel, we agreed that the panelists are going to have a conversation based on three questions. Then we will leave some time from Q&A round from the audience. So please feel free to add your question to the chat box. So in that case, so without any further ado, Megan, welcome to the WDS Charlottesville. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here and also sharing this conversation with you and with my fellow panelists. So one of the first things that Karolina suggested we should talk about is, where are we in the discussion between human rights and data science, and what have we achieved and what's currently lacking? And I think maybe I'll start with the first part of that question, and then I'll be eager to hear my co-panelists' thoughts. As someone with a background, my degree is in biostatistics, and I earned that degree in a public health school. For me, that intersection with human rights seemed pretty obvious, but more than a decade ago, there was a really, really small group of us doing that work. And we're now in, I think, from my perspective, really, we're on our third generation of researchers who are looking at the application of data science to human and civil rights. And so I think if I had to characterize where we are in the discussion, I would say that I think we're through the beginning, and I think we're maybe somewhere in the middle, in the sense that I no longer find myself convincing people that there's a crucial role for data science to play in these applications. I join conversations and folks approach me sort of assuming that there is a role for data science to play. And now the question is, how can we implement those ideas, and how can we, in some cases, put some guardrails around the way some of those tools are getting used so that they're used for the most benefit and so that we avoid some of the worst harms. And so that's really where I think about where we are in that discussion. And working at a human rights nonprofit, I think I also see that the most in the sense that some of the big human rights players, organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, have a pretty robust internal data science program now. And I should mention ACLU as well. All of those organizations have really recognized the value of having in-house expertise and have really been growing those teams. And so I also see that as a sign that we are through that introductory period, but there's still definitely a lot more that we can do. And I'm eager to hear what my other panelists think.
I'm happy to chime in. So building up on what you were saying, Megan, on the guardrails, I think the way I see it, there was this phase in which people started listening to early adopters like yourself and pioneers, and then there was this enthusiasm. And so there was this enthusiasm on data science for social good, broadly termed. And I think that there was a period in which there was a lot of focus in the intent and not that much focus on what was the actual impact. And so there were many cases in which good intents were centered without really being very careful around what were the actual implications of the tools. And so I would say that in addition to, I agree with Megan, being past this introductory period, I think that we're also transitioning from a focus on the intent to a more judicious focus on what the impact is.
So great place for me to chime in to pick up on something each of you have said. And let me just say, I'm delighted to be on the panel with all of you. So I would agree with all of that. And I'd add one further comment, which maybe I would say we're in or going toward, rather in terms of where we are. So I agree with what Megan just said about the focus on intent, moving from a focus on do you have a good intent in what you're doing to the impact. I think that to the extent that a lot of the algorithmic tools or data tools that are used, we're recognizing the way that they can often produce tremendous disparate negative impact on what I would think of as legally protected groups, but because I'm coming from a law school mindset, but racial minorities, women, sexual minorities, etc. But I think up till now, the focus has primarily been on the way in which these tools do that because they're simultaneously potentially unjust in that way, but also inaccurate, that we've looked at the ways in which there's inaccuracy in the data in the sense that if you're looking for, let's say, good employees and you are using data about who managers have rated to be good employees in the past, those managers might have been biased and you're picking up that bias. That's going to produce a disparate impact, but it's also going to replicate a kind of inaccuracy to the extent that those managers didn't recognize the skills of some people. I think we've focused a lot on the kind of combination of inaccuracy and injustice. And that's an important problem. But I think we're coming to realize that addressing that problem is not going to be sufficient, that to the extent you have tools that are based on data about the past, and the past has had injustices in it, those injustices produce real world effects. That is, let's say racial minorities do have less wealth or lower salaries or poorer health or whatever the sphere that you're operating in. And even when you get rid of the inaccuracy in the data, you're going to replicate that injustice if you're not careful not to do so. So I think that we're pivoting now in this conversation from focusing on the combination of inaccuracy and injustice to focusing on ways in which data science tools may reinforce or re-entrench injustice, not because they're making mistakes, but because they're replicating past patterns. And I think that's the problem that's going to be our focus going forward.
Thank you so much to the panelists for these insightful comments. So definitely it is important to keep in mind the intention and the actual impacts of the data and its applications. Also how, for example, Professor Deborah points out that in order to address these kind of impacts, it's not only enough to address them, it's also important that they don't replicate the historical disadvantages, especially minorities and vulnerable groups. This is really important to keep in mind as data scientists and practitioners in this field. Yeah, so definitely this is really important. Thank you so much for this first part of the panel. So I am going to ask the second question, and this is related to what are the main challenges for data science to become a more used and effective tool for protecting human rights? So I am going to assign this for Maria.
I think there's two parts that I would like to highlight here. I think that the first thing is to ensure that data is not a tool to violate human rights. I think that there's one of the interesting things that I think are part of this conversation is that there's kind of two avenues that we're discussing at the same time, right? One is the avenue of data science to protect human rights, and the other one is the making sure that data science tools that are being developed with all sorts of goals are not violating human rights. And so I think that it's very important to keep in mind the fact that these two dimensions are at play, and naturally there are cases in which these intersect. And so an example of that is what we saw last year when the UN shared information that was collected from the Virginia community without appropriate informed consent, right? And I mean, even when we talk about informed consent in this context, it's really hard to talk about informed consent, what it means for communities that have their agency reduced at the time and that depend on an agency that is the one that is collecting the data, right? So I think there's the side of making sure that data science is not harming human rights. In my own personal journey, I started thinking about how do we use data science to advance these goals. And in so many cases, I kept realizing that things that we were developing, as an example, at one point, we were looking at sexual violence in El Salvador, and we looked at data from reports of sexual violence, and we were able to find we were looking at spatiotemporal anomalies, and we were able to find, for example, in the east of the country, cases in which girls between 14 and 16 years old were reporting their boyfriends as the perpetrators at very high rates. And this was part of a data-driven investigative journalism initiative. And when we shared it with the journalists with whom we were working, they said, oh, we had heard rumors of that, but every time we tried to work on this, there was a little bit of a backlash that this was just a stereotype. And so that opened the door for them to write about this, to report on this. And it was really good. But when we tried to think about other uses of this type of anomaly detection, if we said, well, let's inform policies of sexual education, there was this huge risk of underserving populations that were not even at the stage in which they were reporting sexual violence because they didn't trust the institutions. And so I think there's this key element, again, of kind of centering, and I'm going back to my initial point, I guess, of centering the impact and not the intent. So I think that's one important thing. And the other thing that I would say is, I think there's been a lot of focus on one-off initiatives that we've seen in the past years. So many hackathons on data science for social good, in which people that usually do entirely different things spend a weekend advancing human rights. And I think that a shift away from these one-off initiatives and towards funding organizations like the human rights data analysis group that Megan is here representing. And as Megan said, ACLU, there's also a lot of investigative journalism initiatives, a lot of organizations that are really devoted to these. I think that shifting our funds away from one-off initiatives and towards strengthening organizations that are engaging in this seriously is key for us to meaningfully advance this field.
Can I just ask you a question, Maria? That was super interesting. And I'm just wondering, when you look at other uses, like that story of the way that you did use data science is super inspiring. But when you look at other uses, sometimes I worry that in our conversations, on the one hand, we don't want to do harm by the way that we might use new strategies. But on the other hand, sometimes I think we forget what we're comparing it to. It's not that we're comparing some new initiative to a perfect world. We're comparing it to the world that is currently. Do you think that I shouldn't say we, because this is not really, this is your world more than it's my world, which is why I'm asking you this question. Do you think that, and this could be directed at Megan also, that organizations operating in this sphere are too cautious or too enthusiastic to bring their new skills to bear?
Oh, I love this question because I think about it a lot. And I think that I've thought about it in two contexts. There's the using machine learning to assist decisions, which is a lot of my work. And there, I think that the question of how do we compare to the status quo is really important. And I think that there's a lot of non-trivial elements to answering that question that we're only starting to scratch the surface of. I think that, for example, there's a big focus on overall performance, right? And in a one-shot instance, but it's very different when we think about making mistakes with certain randomness, that is the way that humans make those mistakes, and when we're having deterministic decisions and the way that that can create certain harms that are entirely different if, for example, we're now seeing a lot of companies doing the first round of their interviews with ML systems. And if you have a bias that systematically excludes certain communities from accessing employment, that is a new type of harm that is not one that happens when you have a little bit of randomness in the decisions, right? So I think that comparison to the status quo is super important. I've thought about it in the decision support context, but I've also thought about this question from a very different angle I'm a co-founder of the Machine Learning for the Developing World workshop, and there we've done a lot of work and here Megan has done a lot more work. So I'm really curious to hear her answer to the question as soon as I'm done with these. But I think one of the challenges there is that I think there's also a lot of excitement around data-driven tools and machine learning tools. And I think that there's a risk that we suck resources out of initiatives that are a lot less sexy, so to speak, but are much more proven to be successful. And so I think that in many cases, that element that we're comparing to, especially in fields that have very few resources, is really important to consider how, in many cases, we start doing new things with machine learning, and we really haven't measured the impact on that. And so there's, I think, a real risk of taking resources away from other initiatives that are maybe less exciting, but can have a lot of impact. But with this, I'll pass it to Megan because I'm so curious to hear her answer to this question.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I love this question too. And I appreciate your framing too, because I think the answer probably is a little of both, that depending on the context and who's doing the work, there's a little too much enthusiasm and sometimes not enough enthusiasm. And this is where I'll show my own personal bias. Our organization is based in San Francisco. And so we get a lot of Silicon Valley, data science for good, AI for good, fill in your favorite catchphrase for good. And I do think that in a lot of those instances, the intent is positive. Everybody's heart is in the right place, but there's a little too much enthusiasm, and there's a little too much what Maria was pointing out, sort of this excitement about the most kind of cutting edge machine learning tool and the shiniest, most academically interesting application, and not enough deep thinking about, well, what does this problem really need? And so I think both the question about what's the impact and also this question about status quo is absolutely the way our organization really evaluates. Not only should we take on this project, but what tool from our toolbox is appropriate in this particular project. And that's really the question we asked, is knowing that statistical models are always going to be a little bit wrong. You know, every model is wrong, some are useful. And asking ourselves, well, when this estimate or this modeling result is incorrect, what is the cost of that? I hesitate to call it a mistake because it's just sort of the uncertainty that's inherent in these tools. But what is the cost of that, and who bears that cost? And is it us as researchers and as scientists being a little more uncertain, having to do a little more work, or is it perhaps an already vulnerable community that's having some kind of decision or policy made for them that they didn't have necessarily input on? And so really thinking about that in that framing of who's being impacted, and then that question of, are the decisions or the recommendations that this tool is going to result in, are they an improvement on the status quo? And just to give a really quick positive example of a time when we said yes to that question is some work we've done in Mexico, building machine learning models to predict the likely location of undiscovered graves in that country. And those models are imperfect. You know, they are sometimes going to suggest investigations in places where there are not graves, and they're sometimes going to miss the possibility of investigations where there are graves. But the status quo is that there's right now, it's very difficult to advocate for any investigations. And so in conversation with our partners, we decided these results, imperfect though they may be, are an improvement on the status quo. But there are plenty of situations where we have asked ourselves that question and made a different decision. So I think that's a really important way to frame each of these applications.
Thank you so much, Megan, for this insightful idea and thoughts about how we can practice human rights and data science, and how we can think about the communities and the models. So we have like 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask the last question for you panelists, and you have 5 minutes to discuss, and then we are going to see the questions from the audience. So the last question is, what opportunities exist to promote a more fluid dialogue between these two disciplines, data and human rights? And now, Deborah, it's your turn.
So I think that's, so maybe I'll say two things. One is, I think what's so interesting when you get together with people from different fields, whether different fields within the academy or people who are in the academy and people who are working practitioners in the field, is often the difficulty in communicating, that people use terms in different ways. So I'm kind of excited to have so many sessions. I think data science has, because it's a new field, has been wonderful in bringing together both practitioners and scholars from different fields. So that's been really exciting. For me personally, I also think, maybe that sounds too selfish, I don't mean it like that, but what's so interesting about machine learning is, I think, what it's teaching us about discrimination itself and what makes it wrong. So I come from a different background than either of the other two panelists. I work kind of philosophically about what is discrimination and what makes it wrong. And I think what's so exciting about this field is we're learning more about what discrimination is and new ways to think about it that we can then apply both in law and in other areas that I think will enrich our understanding kind of outside of the field of data.
Well, I can jump in on that question next. And this is, I suppose, fairly self-serving, but it is the answer that I try to give whenever I am fortunate enough to have an academic audience, which is that my background, I got a certificate in human rights from Emory University. And the Human Rights Center there was housed within, or shared, I suppose, between the med school and the law school. And I think that's quite common. I think med schools, law schools, and journalism schools are really within the academic framing, the institutions that are coming together to have these really deep programs related to human rights. And especially as we're seeing more data science schools, centers, initiatives, I think they need to get in on that action. And I want to see a lot more universities house a piece of a human rights center within the data science center. And the other way, I want to see more data science centers put their hands up and say, we want to be involved in the human rights and the social justice work that's happening in our university, because I think that's the place where there's the best opportunity for these dialogues and these conversations to continue and to have a place to happen.
I'll just, I guess, echo that point a little bit by saying that I think more than just dialogue across communities, what we need is to have this interdisciplinary space really strengthened. And so I think that it needs to go beyond we talk a little bit to each other, but we're still each in our side of the field, versus we really nurture a community that lives at this intersection, that obviously has people coming initially from the different disciplines, but that we have that interdisciplinary space be strengthened as kind of its own, I don't want to say field per se, but its own space of expertise. I think that is really fundamental, and we're seeing it in programs and also in organizations that are, as I said before, developing these joint skills.
Thank you, Maria. So this is fundamental to keep in mind interdisciplinary in data science and its applications. And we already received some questions from the audience. And the first one is, since these tools can help or harm, how do you evaluate whether they should be applying in a given case, or how to apply them in a such way that help is more likely than harm? So I think, Mega, is your turn.
Sure. Well, I can maybe just elaborate a little bit. I mean, in our team, the way we answer that question really is that framing of what is the cost of these tools making a recommendation or a decision that's incorrect, and who bears that cost. And so we really, in most of our work, we really think about that mostly in the realm of classification tools. And the more we do this work, the more I've started to think everything is some version of a classification problem. And what I mean by classification is I have these two incidents I have these two records that describe a victim who has experienced some kind of human rights violation. Are they the same or are they different? So I need to classify them as that. We also do a lot of kind of circling back to one of, I think, Maria's points that a lot of what needs to be done the most in this field is sort of the stuff that's not considered the most exciting. And that category of things that we do is classifying documents. So we have this record from a Freedom of Information Act request. Is it a memo? Does it have a header? What kind of structure does it have? So these are really kind of mundane seeming questions, but at the end of the day, they're a classification question. Have I assigned the right category to the content of this document? Now, in that case, if I assign the wrong category, I pay the price. It means that I have to spend more time in manual review. I have to work more with training data to improve my model. In the other case, if I'm assigning whether a record refers to the same person or the same incident, getting that wrong has a much higher cost associated with it. So that's a really specific example from my work, but I think the framing can be more broadly applied to ask this question of what's going to happen when a mistake is made, what's going to happen when our models get something wrong, and who bears the cost.
One thing I would add that I think is important in thinking about that is something also that Maria touched on a little bit, and I would call this systematicity. That is, as we've all said, models are going to make mistakes, just like human beings make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and I would fully agree with what Megan said about you want to look at who bears the cost of those mistakes. But I also think you want to think about how broadly the tool is going to be used. Because if an individual person is making mistakes in their single organization, it can only affect a certain number of people. But if the tool, like Maria mentioned, tools that are used to screen job applications, if those are used by lots and lots and lots of big companies, then the people who are excluded from jobs by that hiring tool through some kind of arbitrary glitch in a way that's making it make a mistake, they're going to be excluded from so many jobs, a huge range of jobs across many different employers. And so the effect, it's not just who bears the cost, but how broad the cost is. So I think, and that kind of systemicness is present in some cases, but not in others. And I think it's an important thing to focus on.
And I think one element that is very important is in the past years, we've seen this very strong development in moving away from, we just measure overall accuracy to, we care about where we're making the mistakes. And one thing that I think is crucial and will be a very important space in the coming years is also moving beyond the prediction task. And so when we're deploying models, it may be for decision support, it may be an automated decision. There's first the question of how is that impacting the decisions? Because in many contexts, we care about the human decisions that are being informed by the algorithm and not the algorithmic prediction in itself. And so moving away from evaluating the algorithm in isolation and starting to evaluate how are the decisions that are being informed by the algorithm changing? And also moving away from the static setting of we evaluate our algorithm prior to deployment to evaluating what is happening in the dynamic setting once the algorithm becomes a new actor in the process. And so I think that moving away from predictions to the decisions or whatever it is that is the consequence of the algorithmic prediction, and moving away from the static setting to the dynamic setting is something that is crucial.
And I want to make like a reflection as well based on Maria's idea, and this is how we can measure the impacts of automated systems. And this discussion is addressed by Virginia Evans in her book Automating Inequality. I remember that book because the first time that Maria and I met was in 2020 in this event, Women in Data Science. She suggests that book, and that book discusses how automated systems can harm not only the policies, also communities and people's lives. So this is, I think, it's crucial to keep in mind as well. So I'm going to mention another question from the audience, and this is more like it's conversational. So this conversation has been so enlightening. Could you share one thing that motivates you to do your work? So, Deborah?
Well, in part, a little bit what I said before is learning more about what discrimination is, I think is very interesting. And apropos of the discussion we've been having about accuracy, I think in many people's kind of in the popular imagination, I would say discrimination, wrongful discrimination is kind of brought together with inaccuracy. If somebody doesn't hire someone and they really are qualified and they don't hire them because of their race or their gender, we tend to think that the problem has to do with the inaccuracy. And I think we're seeing more and more that inaccuracy is sort of, I'll say, orthogonal to the problem of wrongful discrimination, that what we're worried about is kind of perpetuating systemic hierarchies or something along those lines, that it doesn't really have that much to do with inaccuracy. Inaccuracy is kind of a fact of life. You know, people aren't perfect, machines aren't perfect. Inaccuracy itself or mistakes, that's really not what the problem is. The problem is when the burden of those mistakes disproportionately affect certain people. And I think we need to move our public imagination and our legal system away from a focus on inaccuracy or mistakes.
I love that. And I'll maybe use that to springboard into my personal motivation is really related to my feelings about math and statistics, I suppose. But the way I ended up in this particular field is that I was raised by a couple of hippies. And so my whole life I had this expectation that I needed to put something better out into the world. And, I was trying to make the world a little bit better in whatever way I could. And I was also always a math nerd my whole life. And so I had a hard time sort of figuring out how was I going to get to do both of those things. And I definitely went through a period of time when I was thinking, I'm not the kind of person who's going to go be a medical professional on the front lines. I'm not going to, go be a first responder or do those sort of hands-on things. And so finding this intersection and finding it as a way that I could use the skill set that I feel like I have to achieve the thing that I wanted to achieve, is how I ended up here. And then in terms of what keeps me moving, to come back to Deborah's sort of description of shifting our viewpoint, I think what I've found in my work is that one of my favorite things about statistics and data science is its ability to estimate what we don't know. It's almost like a magic trick, like that we can take those little pockets of things that we couldn't observe, stories that we're never going to have access to for a wide variety of reasons. And without placing additional burden on those vulnerable populations, we can use a statistical tool to fill in some of those gaps and to make better conclusions and to tell more complete stories. And it does take both of those things. I'm not saying that, statistical tools are the only tool we need to achieve that, but given that is the tool that I have access to, I think it's a pretty cool magic trick to be able to tell more of a story about what you don't know.
I loved hearing your story of how you got to where you're at, and it resonated a lot with kind of the path that I navigated, because I did my undergrad in math. And so like you, I was just very excited about math, but I also had these other interests. And so I first started working as a journalist. I would study math in the morning and be a journalist in the afternoon. And it was just these two entirely disconnected parts of my life, basically. And then trying to weave them together was how I got to the joint PhD in machine learning and public policy that I did. And I think that what motivates me now is the fact that we have new technologies. We've had all of these advances in machine learning. And I don't think that it's a given that it'll necessarily have positive societal impacts, but I do think that it can. And so what it motivates me is figuring out, how do we use these tools, and how do we also shift the future development of how we advance machine learning in order to have the societal impact that we'd want with it. And a big part of it is then what leads me to try to characterize what are the risks of the technologies that we have now, and then seeing how can we design them in different ways and integrate them into socio-technical systems in different ways so that they can have the type of societal impact that we may wish they did.
So I would like to share why I decided this path as a data science and a lawyer, and this is because I feel to align with those your stories. Oh, sorry. I feel that I am aligned with your stories and personal motivations, how we can improve the algorithms. And this is kind of my mission and my goal as a data scientist, because also I face injustices when I was working as a lawyer in Colombia. And also I realized that if we don't have an appropriate automated systems, we cannot combat discrimination, we cannot fight against violence and so on. So this is unique sometimes, but sometimes you need to go beyond your own belief and believe in yourself and think about the social change is happening, and you can be part of that. And part of that, it means also use data science as a good tool to think about the impacts and how we can improve that. So this is kind of my path in data science as a lawyer. So and actually I have like maybe one question more for the audience. Actually another, okay. Making data more complete often means intensifying surveillance and data identification. How do you respond to human rights implications of surveillance? So Megan, can you help with us?
Yeah.
We have 3 minutes left, so
okay.
we can close with this question.
Okay. That's definitely one of the concerns that we often raise, specifically in the work we're doing in the US criminal justice system, although this applies elsewhere. To return to Deborah's point that a lot of machine learning models are replicating the existing human bias in the data that we have access to. And that is absolutely true. But especially when you're talking about things like arrest data and crime data being used to evaluate these allegedly predictive models, when you talk about sort of fixing the data in some way to make it less biased, that's exactly what you're advocating for, whether you mean to or not. You're advocating for more surveillance, to have more complete data. And that isn't always a net positive. And so I think for me, that's one of the things that brings it back to statistics as such a fascinating tool, because we can sometimes, not always, use other tools at our disposal to correctly account for or adjust in some ways the incompleteness and the bias that may exist in data without necessarily changing that incompleteness. Now, that isn't always the right solution. I mean, there are certainly lots of other examples where I think we should be collecting more complete data, and there's not a particularly good reason other than money and resources that we're not. But I think to bring it back to this common theme we've all had about impact, really thinking through when you're advocating for more data or more complete data or data disaggregated by certain attributes, it tends to be a much more complicated question than I think we sometimes initially think it is, because there are definitely applications, especially I'm thinking in the health field, where there's tremendous advocacy right now to collect more disaggregated and more specific data so that members of those groups can advocate for better access, better treatment, better outcomes. And so sometimes that is the better approach, but really thinking about unintended consequences and what more and different and more granular data could really mean and what that impact is going to have, I think is absolutely crucial when we raise these questions and these concerns.
I love this question and that answer. And I think that one of the elements that is important is the fact that in the past years, and that's one of the fields where I've been focused, our attention to the risk of fairness has grown a lot. And that is great, but one thing that I see sometimes as a risk is reducing ethics to fairness. And then precisely what Megan was saying, that leads to things like, oh, we just need more data. And that will mitigate unfairness, but there's so many other ethical concerns and so many other types of harms that I think is important to keep inside, because that's definitely a risk that exists. And I think it's central that we move away from a notion of more is always better in data science.
Okay, so thank you so much, Megan, Maria, and Deborah. It has been a pleasure to discuss with you and be part of this Women in Data Science Charlottesville this year. So to the audience, thank you for joining us. And now please enjoy a brief video before our next session. Thank you so much.